They said he was just another drifter, a broken cowboy with nothing left but an old horse and the ghosts of war. But one evening, on the far edge of his father's ruined ranch, a wild Mustang appeared. It didn't flee. It watched. It waited. And then it turned as if beckoning him into the pines. What the cowboy found at the end of that trail wasn't a legend or gold or even salvation. It was something far more shocking, a secret locked inside a rotting cabin that would change his life and the town's history forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Elias Boone had spent the better part of 4 years in uniform, fighting a war that had eaten men alive and spat out their bones across every valley and ridge from Virginia to Tennessee. He came home with nothing but scars, a battered coat, and the uneasy silence of a man who had seen too much. Wyoming stretched before him now, vast, windswept, and strangely indifferent to whether he lived or died. The mare beneath him, an aging bay that had carried him since the last days of the war, stumbled on the rocky trail. Elias leaned forward, stroking the rough mane with a gloved hand. "Easy, girl. We're almost there." His voice was hoarse, carrying the rasp of sleepless nights and too much smoke in the lungs. The animal flicked an ear but kept moving. The horizon broke into open prairie golden grass, rippling like a restless sea. And in the distance, nestled against the rolling land and a fringe of dark pines, lay the Boone Ranch. It had been years since he had last seen it, years spent chasing orders and survival rather than family. His father, Silas Boone, had died while Elias was still on campaign. A letter reached him in a winter camp announcing that Silas's heart had finally failed. Elias hadn't even made it back in time for the funeral. He carried that guilt like a hidden bullet lodged under the skin. Now every step closer to the ranch tightened the weight inside his chest. He adjusted his coat, threadbare and stained. The wind tugged at the hem, revealing patches his own rough stitching had held together. One shoulder still bore the memory of shrapnel, a scar that flared whenever the air grew cold. His face, once young and clean, had aged into hard lines, a beard shadowing a jaw that rarely smiled. He was not returning as a son, but as a survivor, uncertain if home could still mean anything. The trail dipped, and soon he saw the wooden gate of the Boone Ranch, or what was left of it. The sign that once read Boone Ranch hung crooked, its letters faded by sun and storm until they were barely legible. One hinge groaned as the wind pushed the gate back and forth like the pendulum of some broken clock. Elias dismounted slowly, boots hitting the earth with a dull thud. He tied the mare loosely and stepped forward. His hand brushed the weathered wood of the gatepost, rough under his calloused fingers. "Pa." His voice cracked in the wind. "I'm here." The words sounded pitiful, carried away almost before they left his mouth. Inside the fence line, ruin greeted him. The stables sagged half their roof, collapsed timbers bleached gray and splintering. Tall weeds choked the yard, some reaching his waist. The water trough was bone-dry algae, crusted along the rim. The old well, once the heartbeat of the ranch, was capped with a warped board long unused. And then he saw them, 3 horses lingering near the far corner of the pasture, or what passed for horses, now ribs, showing beneath dull coats, heads lowered in weary grazing. One lifted its gaze to Elias, eyes hollow, nostrils flaring in faint recognition before it turned away again. These creatures had once been proud stock, Boone bred for strength and endurance. His father had built a reputation across the territory for horses that could outlast any trail. To see them like this, reduced, starving, made Elias's throat tighten. He remembered the ranch differently. He saw flashes of boyhood himself racing across the field on a fiery chestnut pony, his father shouting encouragement from the fence. his mother gone long before, laughing on the porch while supper simmered on the stove. He remembered the smell of hay, the bright ring of hammers in the blacksmith shed the rhythm of hooves, echoing like music. Now only silence remained, broken by the rasp of wind and the caw of a crow perched on the roof of the barn. Elias knelt, fingers digging into the dry soil. What did you expect? He thought bitterly. You left him here alone year after year while you played soldier. And now you come home to claim the bones of what he built. He rose, shoulders heavy, and guided his mare toward the house. The cabin, built of thick logs by Elias's grandfather, still stood but bore the scars of neglect. Shingles were missing, shutters hung by single nails, and the porch sagged dangerously. Dust coated the windows so thoroughly they reflected only pale light. Inside, the air was cold and stale. His boots echoed on wooden floors stripped bare. The living room held only a rocking chair and a small coffee table, both gray with dust. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, swaying slightly as the door shut behind him. Elias dropped his pack onto the floor. The thud stirred motes of dust into the air, dancing in the late afternoon sun. He sank onto the sofa, a relic that groaned under his weight. The springs protested, as though resentful of carrying yet another boon burden. He closed his eyes, but peace did not come. That night, sleep was a battlefield all its own. In dreams, he was back in the war. Cannons thundered, tearing earth into black smoke and flame. Men screamed, some with rage, others with pain. He saw faces young, terrified, and gone too soon. He saw comrades crumble under musket fire, blood soaking into fields that had once grown corn. He heard the whistling of shells, the hiss before impact, the choking silence afterward. "Boone, get down," someone shouted in his memory. He turned too late. An explosion of dirt and shrapnel ripped through the ranks. The shockwave slammed him into the ground. His ears rang with a high, endless note. When it faded, he was alone, bodies strewn across the mud. He woke, gasping, heart racing, the cabin cloaked in darkness. The only sound was the faint creak of timber in the wind. Yet even that small sound twisted into the echo of gunfire in his mind. Elias pressed his palms to his eyes, willing himself to breathe. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the chill. He had returned from war, but the war had not left him. The days crawled by in silence. Elias tried to work, patched a bit of fence, shoveled rotting hay, led the half-starved horses to what grass he could find. But progress was slow, and the weight inside him heavier than the tasks. When his body stilled, his thoughts returned to Silas Boone. His father had been a stern man, carved of stone and silence. He had raised Elias with discipline rather than tenderness. Mornings began before sunrise, chores finished before a bite of breakfast. "A Boone earns his keep," Silas used to say, jaw-tight, eyes sharp as flint. There had been good moments too, though Elias rarely admitted them. His father teaching him to ride properly, correcting his grip on the reins, steadying his hand when a horse bucked. Even then, Silas's approval came more as a nod than a smile. The last time they had spoken, a year before Silas died, their words had been clipped and cold. Elias had been in uniform, then preparing to return to the front. His father had stood at the gate arms, folded voice low. "You've made your choice," Silas had said. "I have Pa. The country needs men. The ranch needs men too. Needs you." Elias had clenched his jaw. "It'll still be here when I get back." His father's eyes had narrowed gray with disappointment. Maybe, maybe not. And that was the last exchange. No reconciliation, no embrace, only silence and distance. Then came the letter of death, now the emptiness of a house where no one waited. Elias wandered the rooms, searching for traces of the man he had lost. He found an old saddle cracked with age, carefully stored. A pile of bills for veterinary care, each neatly filed in his father's handwriting. A faded photograph of a boy, astride a pony himself, no more than 9, grinning as Silas's shadow stretched beside him. He sank into the rocking chair, holding the photo, and whispered, "Lay Ra, I should have come back sooner." The words barely reached his own ears. Morning brought no relief. Fog clung to the fields like a shroud. Crows flapped across the sky, their harsh calls echoing over the broken barn. Elias stepped outside boots, crunching through frost on the weeds. The horses lifted their heads, eyes following him warily, then returned to their meager grazing. He walked the fence line, hands shoved deep into his coat. Every post leaned, every board cracked. The land seemed to mock him. "You don't belong here. You left too long. You're nothing but a ghost among ghosts." At the far corner he stopped. The weeds swayed in the mist, rattling dry seeds. The ranch felt less like a home and more like a graveyard, holding the bones of his father, his family, and perhaps himself. He set one hand on the top rail of the broken fence and whispered, "Maybe I'm just another wandering ghost." Same as this place. The western fence line of the Boone Ranch stretched long and weary against the backdrop of autumn sky. Elias Boone walked it with the slow gait of a man who had too many thoughts crowding his head and too many chores on his shoulders. In one hand he carried a hammer, in the other a coil of wire. Nails clinked faintly in a tin box hanging at his belt. The grass here was brittle and yellow, whispering against his boots as the wind pressed across the field. The air carried that dry bite of October, cold enough to make his breath visible, not yet cruel enough to freeze his hands. Overhead the sky sagged with gray clouds, heavy and low, letting through only ribbons of pale light. He stopped by a collapsed section of fence, 3 posts rotted clear through at the base. The boards had fallen like dead soldiers lying half buried in weeds. Elias knelt, running a hand along the grain of one post. It crumbled under his fingers, releasing a smell of damp mold. He shook his head. Pa would have had my hide if he saw this. He muttered, setting the post upright, only to watch it flop sideways again. Never let the fence rot. Never let the land forget its keeper. The word stung because Silas Boone wasn't here to bark them anymore. All that remained was Elias kneeling among weeds, trying to patch up a ranch that had forgotten what strength felt like. He measured the space for a new rail, then leaned back, resting on his heels. That was when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the prairie wind or the groan of wood. It was faint, deliberate, like the shift of weight against dry leaves. Elias froze, tilting his head toward the tree line that fringed the property. The pines there stood tall and still, their trunks dark against the pale sky. Yet from the shadows between them came a sound, hoofbeats, a slow, cautious. At first, Elias thought it might be one of his own ragged horses that had wandered this far. But the steps were too measured, too heavy with presence. He rose, squinting, and then it appeared. From the gloom beneath the trees stepped a Mustang, wild and unclaimed, its mane tangled like river weeds, its coat a storm of dust and scars. Sunlight caught in its eyes, bright, unblinking, sharp as a blade. Its chest swelled with each breath, sending clouds of vapor into the cold air. Elias felt the hammer slip slightly in his grip. He set it down carefully, hand brushing instead, against the butt of his revolver at his belt. The instinct of a soldier, not a rancher. The Mustang did not charge, did not bolt. It simply stood as though the field belonged to it, and Elias was the trespasser. The animal's left hind leg bore a faint hitch, a healed wound, maybe the skin drawn tight around an old cut. Yet the strength in its stance was undeniable. Every muscle seemed wired with defiance. Most Mustangs fled at the first scent of man. This one did not. It stared directly at him, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. The tail swished, once deliberate. Elias slowly lifted his hands from his gun palms outward. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm not looking for trouble." The horse exhaled sharply, white breath streaming from its nose. Its hooves dug into the earth, but it did not move away. The distance between them seemed to shrink, without either of them stepping closer. Elias felt the weight of that gaze burrow into him. He had faced enemy rifles across battlefields, stared down, bayonets felt the rush of death near enough to taste. Yet somehow this quiet moment held the same kind of pressure, an unspoken challenge. It was not fear he felt. It was something else, a test. He remembered his father once saying, long ago while they broke colts together, "Some horses don't just see you, they measure you. Decide if you're worth their trust or their bite." Looking at the Mustang now, Elias heard that echo as if Silas himself stood at his shoulder. The Mustang's eyes narrowed, studying him, not as prey, not even as foe, but as though weighing his soul. Elias's breath slowed. He set the hammer aside, stood with arms loose at his sides, letting the animal see there was no threat here. Minutes dragged like hours. Neither moved. Only the wind shifted, rattling the dry grass around them. Finally, Elias spoke again, voice low, almost reverent. "What do you want from me?" The horse flicked an ear head, tilting slightly as if it understood. Then it tossed its mane and stamped the ground once. Something stirred deep in Elias's chest, an old sensation he hadn't felt since before the war. His pulse quickened, not with panic, but anticipation. It was the same rush he felt in the moments before battle, standing in silence, before the charge, knowing something irreversible was about to unfold. The Mustang did not look ready to flee. Instead, it shifted sideways, turning its body slightly toward the forest, as if pointing the way. Elias frowned. "You want me to follow, is that it?" The horse blew air from its nostrils, a soft snort, then took 3 deliberate steps back toward the shadowed trail leading into the pines. It stopped, turned its head, and fixed him again with those piercing eyes. The meaning seemed absurd, yet undeniable. This was not chance, this was invitation. His heart thudded. The rationale part of him scoffed horses didn't invite men anywhere. But the war had taught him to listen to instinct when logic faltered. Instinct had saved his life more times than he could count. And instinct now whispered, "Go with it." Elias licked dry lips. "Where in God's name do you plan on taking me, beast?" The Mustang answered with silence, only the subtle sway of its body half turned toward the trail. Elias sighed, rubbing his jaw. Well, hell. He turned back to his mare, still tethered to the sagging fence. She pawed the ground, uneasy ears, flicking toward the Mustang. Elias laid a hand on her neck. "Stay here, old friend. Won't be long." He tied the reins to a broken post, giving her a reassuring pat. "Keep the home fires burning." When he straightened again, the Mustang had already taken a few steps into the trees. Its body moved with a fluid grace, despite the faint limp in its hind leg. Sunlight caught in its mane as it passed between shadows. It paused, then head lifting to check if he followed. Elias felt a strange pull inside, something between dread and curiosity. He reached for the handle of his knife, slipping it into his belt. The hammer he left by the fence, too heavy, too clumsy for whatever lay ahead. Drawing a long breath, he muttered, "All right then, lead on." His boots carried him forward, crunching over dry weeds across the invisible threshold between pasture and forest. The Mustang moved ahead, silent but steady, pausing every few strides to glance back, its eyes flashing in the dim light. The prairie gave way to shadows, pine needles muffling his steps. The air grew cooler beneath the canopy. And with each step deeper into the woods, Elias Boone could not shake the feeling that he was being pulled not just into a forest, but into the teeth of fate itself. The trail wound deeper beneath the canopy, each step muffled by a quilt of pine needles and brittle leaves. Elias Boone followed his breath, puffing in small clouds, his boots crunching over roots that coiled like bones in the soil. The Mustang kept just ahead of him, always close enough to see, never near enough to touch. Each time Elias lagged, the horse paused, head-turning eyes flashing like coals in the dim light. Then it would step forward again, urging him deeper into the woods. He muttered, "You've got a purpose, don't you, Lord? Help me for listening to a horse." Branches clawed at his coat. The light dwindled gold, bleeding into gray, as the sun slid lower in the sky. Somewhere far above, a raven croaked the sound, harsh in the stillness. The forest pressed in tight, each tree shouldering the next, their trunks like watchful sentinels. Elias's hand brushed the hilt of his knife more than once. He told himself it was foolishness, that he was following nothing but instinct and fancy. But still he followed. After what felt like a half-mile, the trees began to thin. The path widened, and a faint clearing opened ahead. Through the shifting shadows, Elias glimpsed the outline of a structure. His heart thumped harder. The Mustang halted at the edge of the clearing, stamping once. Then it tossed its head as if to say, "Here." Elias stepped past, eyes narrowing as the shape came into focus. A cabin stood in the clearing, or what remained of one. The roof sagged, the porch listing like a ship caught mid-sink. Ivy and moss had conquered half the walls. On the eave, swinging by, one rusted nail, hung a sign so weathered its letters were little more than scars in the wood. Elias squinted, tilting his head. Whitfield Homestead, he read aloud, the syllables tasting foreign on his tongue. The name meant nothing to him, yet it carried weight. Something in the sound, the way it clung to the cold air, felt heavy, like a story, half buried, waiting to be dug up. The place looked deserted, yet the kind of deserted that didn't come naturally. Elias approached slowly, boots stirring the brittle weeds. The cabin's timbers were blotched with mildew, boards splitting in jagged seams. One corner of the roof had caved in, leaving a gaping wound. The windows were scabbed over with grime curtains long rotted away. It was too quiet. No birds in the eaves, no squirrels scrambling in the brush. Only the steady whistle of wind threading through gaps in the walls, making the boards sigh and groan. Elias mounted the steps, and the porch creaked so loudly he froze, half expecting the whole frame to collapse beneath him. He pressed a hand against the door. The wood was swollen rough under his palm. He rattled the handle and stopped. It was locked. From the inside, his brow furrowed. That's not right. Cabins left to rot usually hung open doors, swinging hinges rusting free. No one locked ruin from within. He leaned closer. A smell seeped out between the cracks, faint but undeniable. An odor both sour and heavy. It was the stink of rot, of damp wood, of something trapped too long without air. Elias's stomach tightened. His hand drifted to his revolver, thumb brushing the worn grip. Every instinct screamed this was no ordinary ruin. Something about it whispered danger or tragedy. He took a step back, eyes scanning the clearing. The Mustang stood at the edge of the trees, ears pricked, watching intently. Elias exhaled a fog of uncertainty, leaving his lungs. "All right," he murmured, tightening his jaw. "Let's see what you've dragged me into." He planted his shoulder against the door, gripping the revolver by the barrel like a club. With a grunt, he slammed forward. The hinges screeched, metal screaming against wood, but held. He stepped back and drove his shoulder again, harder this time. The frame groaned. A third blow and the lock splintered. The door shuddered open an inch, then another, until it gave way with a tortured squeal. A wave of air rushed out thick and choking. Elias staggered back, coughing, the foulness burning his throat. He yanked the collar of his coat across his mouth and forced himself inside. The light was dim, a watery glow filtering through a broken window. Shadows ruled the room. Dust lay thick as snow on every surface. A table lay overturned, one leg snapped. Chairs sprawled, broken across the floor. Cobwebs drooped from the rafters, swaying like ghostly banners. The smell was worse here, a blend of mildew and something heavier, metallic and sour. He lifted his knife, holding it low, his other hand guiding the beam of light from the doorway. His boots crunched on brittle debris, mouse droppings, dried leaves, fragments of plaster. He swallowed, heart hammering harder than it had in battle. The main room gave way to a narrow hall. Doors lined either side, most ajar, showing only dust and emptiness. But one door at the end stood shut, latched tight. Elias's gut twisted. He moved toward it, each step stirring the boards to groans. The door was smaller, built sturdier than the others, as if meant to keep something out or in. The latch was jammed. Elias pressed his ear against the wood. The silence on the other side was thick, oppressive. He drew back, gripped the handle, and shoved. Nothing. He snarled under his breath and rammed his shoulder. Still nothing. His pulse spiked. He backed up 2 steps and slammed forward with his boot. The frame cracked. Another kick, and the latch gave way, splintering. The door burst inward, and a gust of rank air surged over him, thicker, hotter, suffocating. Elias, gagged eyes watering. He raised an arm to shield his face as he stepped inside. The room was small, windowless, its low ceiling pressing down. His eyes adjusted slowly. Rags littered the floor, stained and damp. Coils of rope lay discarded in the corner. Scratch marks clawed the wood near the door, frantic and deep. And then he saw it. A shape lay curled in the gloom. At first his mind told him it was a corpse. A human body left to decay in the dark. He froze, breath caught in his throat. But then the shape shifted. A faint twitch of fingers. A shallow rise of chest. It was a woman. Elias rushed forward, dropping to one knee. The figure was young, gaunt, her skin pale as parchment. Her hair clung in dark tangles to her temples, damp with sweat. Her lips were cracked, her eyelids fluttering, though they did not open. "God Almighty," Elias whispered. He reached out, finding her wrist. The skin was cold, but beneath it, he felt a pulse, weak but alive. Relief hit him like a blow. Her hands bore raw marks where rope had bitten deep. A filthy scrap of blanket clung to her shoulders. Her chest rose in uneven breaths, each one thin and fragile. She was not dead, not yet. Elias bent low, his voice steady despite the thunder in his chest. "Stay with me. You hear, you're not alone now." Her lips parted, a soundless whimper escaping. He worked quickly. From his coat he pulled a canteen, unscrewed the cap with trembling hands. He tipped it gently, letting a few drops wet her lips. At first she coughed, choking, but then her throat moved, swallowing weakly. "That's it. Easy now," he coaxed. "You're safe." She moaned faintly, eyelids fluttering, but did not wake. Elias slid his coat from his shoulders and draped it over her, wrapping the warmth around her frail frame. The blanket she'd been given was no more than rotting cloth. His coat smelled of sweat and leather, but it was clean, solid. He slipped an arm beneath her shoulders, another beneath her knees. Her body weighed almost nothing, but the limpness of unconsciousness made it awkward. With a grunt, he lifted her, holding her close against his chest. "Got you," he muttered, adjusting his grip. "You're not staying here another damn minute." The floorboards groaned beneath his boots as he staggered back down the hall. Dust swirled around them, stinging his eyes. Each creak felt like it might give way and swallow them both. At the threshold, he shoved the door wider with his shoulder and stepped out. The first breath of cold air outside struck him like baptism. He sucked it in greedily, blinking against the pale light. And then the Mustang was there, standing at the porch, eyes blazing. The animal threw its head and loosed a sharp, ringing neigh that cut through the clearing like a trumpet. Elias froze, cradling the woman in his arms. The sound reverberated wild and triumphant, as if the horse itself declared victory. He looked down at the fragile life in his arms, then back at the Mustang. "So this is why," he whispered hoarsely. "This is why you led me here." The horse pawed the earth, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Elias tightened his hold on the woman, nodding once. His throat ached with the surge of gratitude and awe that filled him. "All right," he said softly. "Let's get her out of this hell." The Mustang snorted a sound almost approving, and Elias Boone, burdened but resolute, carried the girl away from the ruin of Whitfield Homestead, his heart pounding with the knowledge that fate had just shifted beneath his boots. The weight of the woman in his arms felt both fragile and immense. Elias Boone adjusted her against his chest, careful not to jostle her too roughly as he descended the cabin steps. Her head lolled against his shoulder strands of tangled hair, brushing his jaw. Her breath, though faint, was still there, a tremor of life that drove him forward. At the edge of the clearing, his mare waited, restless ears flicking as though she sensed the urgency. The Mustang, silent, solemn, stood nearby like a sentry. Elias exhaled hard, tightening his hold on the girl. "All right," he muttered, voice low, "we've got a long ride ahead." He hoisted her into the saddle first, steadying her limp body with one arm as he swung up behind. He cradled her close, one hand wrapped around the reins, the other supporting her as best he could. Her head lolled against his chest, lips cracked and dry. He uncapped his canteen and let a few drops fall against her mouth. Her throat twitched. She swallowed weakly, a faint sound escaping. "That's it," he whispered, nudging the mare forward. "Just keep breathing, girl. I'll get you safe." The forest swallowed them again, moonlight threading through the canopy in silver strands. The trail twisted like a serpent, roots and shadows conspiring to trip him, but the mare kept steady. The wind hissed through the branches above, carrying the smell of resin and cold earth. Behind the Mustang followed without sound, its hooves whispering over the leaf litter, each step sure and unwavering. Elias glanced back once, catching the gleam of its eyes. It wasn't abandoning them. It was escorting them home. The hours stretched long. The night grew colder, the stars sharp as needles overhead. Elias's breath fogged before him, his arms stiff with fatigue as he held the girl against his chest. Now and then, he murmured words to keep himself steady. "Stay with me. You're not dying out here. Not on my watch." The mare's hooves found the packed dirt road that led to town, the sound louder now, more deliberate. In the distance, lantern lights flickered faint against the horizon. Lone Rock was near. By the time he reached the small town square, the hour was late. The moon had climbed high, washing the wooden storefronts in pale light. Most windows were dark shutters drawn, though the faint glow of an oil lamp burned here and there. The rhythm of hooves on the cobblestones drew attention. A door opened, and then another. A voice rang out sharp with alarm. "Who's that? What's he carrying?" Figures spilled from the shadows, men pulling on coats, women clutching shawls, children rubbing sleep from their eyes. Elias pulled the mare to a halt in front of the apothecary shop, its sign creaking above the door. He slid from the saddle, his arms tightening as he lowered the woman into his hold once more. "She's dying," he shouted, pounding his fist against the locked door. "Get me the doctor now." The thud echoed down the street, rattling windows. More townsfolk gathered, murmurs rising. Elias's face hollowed by exhaustion, and grit made some recoil. He looked half wild, coat-torn eyes, burning soot and dust smeared across his jaw. Yet the urgency in his voice left no room for dismissal. "Who is she?" a woman demanded, clutching her shawl tighter. "Found her in the woods," Elias snapped, though not unkindly. "She's still breathing. But she won't last long if someone doesn't help." The murmurs swelled. Someone ran down the street calling for the sheriff. Others pressed closer, peering at the limp form in his arms. The crowd parted as a tall figure approached, revolver gleaming at his side. Sheriff Harlan Reed strode forward, his hat shadowing his eyes, his jaw set in stone. He eyed Elias, then the girl, then back to Elias. What in hell is going on here? Elias drew a breath, his words clipped, urgent. Cabin in the woods. Old place with a sign, Whitfield Homestead. Found her locked inside, near dead. She needs help. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. That place folks said it's been empty 20 years. Empty don't lock its own doors from the inside, Elias shot back. His grip tightened around the girl. Sheriff argued later. Right now she needs a doctor. Before Reed could answer, another figure pushed through the crowd, a stout woman with sleeves rolled and a medical satchel in hand. Dr. Clara Monroe Lone Rock's only physician wasted no time. Bring her inside, she commanded. Her voice was brisk, leaving no space for hesitation. Elias followed, laying the girl gently on the counter, cleared hastily of bottles and jars. Clara bent over her fingers, searching for a pulse. Faint, she muttered, then pressed her ear to the girl's chest. Breathing shallow, severely dehydrated. She rummaged through her satchel, producing a flask and cloth. We'll need fluids, warmth, and rest. If she holds the night, she may survive. Elias hovered fists, clenching and unclenching. Sheriff Reed leaned against the doorframe, eyes dark. You say you found her at Whitfield? He asked slowly. Elias nodded. Door was locked from inside. Place reeked. Rope rags looked like she'd been kept there. Reed's brow furrowed. That homestead's cursed ground boon? Folks avoid it for a reason. Curse or not, someone left her there to die. Elias growled. The sheriff didn't argue, though. Suspicion lingered in his gaze. As Clara worked, the girl stirred faintly. Her eyes fluttered open, pale and unfocused. Her lips moved, cracked skin parting to whisper a few words. Whitfield, house, dispute. Her voice was little more than a rasp. Elias bent close, steadying her hand. Don't talk. You're safe now. Rest. Clara touched his arm, shaking her head. Let her sleep. She's too weak. Elias nodded, brushing the damp hair from the girl's forehead. But the fragments she had spoken lodged deep in his mind. Whitfield? Dispute? Words that hinted at something larger, something rooted in the land itself. By dawn, the story had taken on a life of its own. In Lone Rock, news traveled faster than the stagecoach, and by the time the sun gilded the rooftops, the tale was everywhere, on the lips of farmers buying feed women, at the well gamblers in the saloon. They say Boone carried her out of Whitfield cabin, someone whispered over coffee. Sheriff found rope burns on her wrists, another replied. That ain't no accident. But the part that spread quickest and widest was the strangest of all. They say it was a wild Mustang led him there. In Clara O'Donnell's cafe, the story grew richer with every telling. Clara, herself plump and bright-eyed, repeated it to anyone who would listen, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. That horse found him, C, didn't run like a normal Mustang. No, it waited. Stared at him until he followed. If not for that beast, she'd be dead by now. Customers leaned in, breath held. One man whistled low. A horse that saves lives. Never heard of such a thing. Clara's eyes twinkled. Well, you have now. Not everyone was convinced. On the boardwalk outside the general store, two ranchers leaned against the rail, skeptical smirks tugging their lips. A Mustang playing guardian angel, one scoffed. Sounds like Boone hit the bottle harder than he admits. The other chuckled. Or maybe he made up a story so folks won't ask why he was prowling the Whitfield place at night. Yet for every doubter, there were those whose eyes softened when they spoke of Elias Boone. The man had returned from war, a shadow living alone on a dying ranch. Now he was the talk of Lone Rock, whether for madness or miracle. The night after the rescue, Elias expected the Mustang to vanish back into the wilderness where it belonged. That was the way of wild horses. One moment they drifted close enough to touch, the next they dissolved into the horizon, untamed and unreachable. He assumed he would never see the animal again, that it had appeared only for that strange, miraculous hour when a dying girl needed saving. But at dawn, when Elias stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, his eyes caught movement beyond the fence. Far across the field where the grass bent in the wind, a silhouette stood proud and still. The Mustang. Its mane rippled in the breeze, dark against the pale sky. Elias narrowed his eyes, half convinced he was imagining it. But when the wind shifted, the horse tossed its head, sunlight glinting off the curve of its neck. Then it turned deliberately, as if to say, "I'm still here." Day after day it remained. Sometimes Elias would spot it on the ridge above the ranch, outlined against the sky like a watchful guardian. Other times it lingered close to the sagging fence ears, twitching eyes fixed on the house. It never came closer unbidden, but it never truly left either. One morning, leaning against the porch rail, Elias whispered into the empty air, "You haven't abandoned me, then. Maybe you ought to stay." The horse flicked an ear, pawed the earth, and remained where it was. Elias began leaving offerings. Small bundles of hay placed just beyond the fence posts. The first time, the Mustang stood 20 yards off, watching him with a wary eye. Elias set the hay down and walked away without looking back. Later, when he returned, the hay was gone. The ground bore the fresh marks of hooves. The next day, Elias did it again. This time, he sat on a stump beneath the old elm tree and waited. The Mustang paced at the edge of the meadow, nostrils flaring, then snorted and retreated into the hills. Elias stayed put for an hour, silent as stone, before finally rising and leaving the offering behind. On the third day, the horse crept closer, inch by inch, until it dared lower its head to the hay, while Elias sat 10 paces away. Any sudden move, and it bolted. Elias made none. He simply watched, hands resting loosely on his knees, heart beating slow. A week passed in this ritual of patience. The distance between them narrowed. Each time Elias remained still, the Mustang permitted a few steps closer. Finally, one late afternoon when the sky was painted in copper light, Elias tried something new. He stood with a small clutch of hay in his palm, arm extended. The horse snorted, ears flattening suspicion, flashing in its eyes. But after a long, taut pause, it lowered its head and took the hay from his hand. Its lips brushed his skin warm, trembling alive. Elias exhaled, almost a laugh, almost a prayer. The moment felt like a handshake, a silent agreement struck between two souls too stubborn to run anymore. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, the cold biting through his shirt. Out in the field, the Mustang grazed beneath the moonlight, its dark body glowing faintly silver. For the first time since the war, Elias felt something more than weariness or grief. He felt stillness, peace, fragile but real. The horse had brought it. Not whiskey, not the hollow cheer of town, not even prayer had done what this creature managed by simply existing. He set his coffee cup aside and whispered into the quiet solace, "That's the name you deserve." The word hung in the air, soft as mist. The Mustang lifted its head as though it had heard, though perhaps it was only the wind. Still, Elias smiled. Solace. A name not of conquest, but of comfort. The first thing in years that eased the weight on his chest.
In the days that followed, he
dared to bring Solace closer. One morning, he coaxed the horse toward the old barn. The place was half collapsed, but still offered shelter. Solace balked at the doorway, nostrils flaring, hooves striking sparks against the stone threshold. Elias raised both hands, voice calm. No harm here, just want to see that leg of yours. Patience won where force never could. He did not tug, did not lash. He simply waited, speaking in a low drawl, until Solace, with a toss of its mane, stepped cautiously inside. Dust drifted down from the rafters as the animal's hooves stirred the straw. Elias crouched, eyes scanning the scar on the hind leg. The flesh was healed, though tight, a thin line of old injury. Not enough to cripple, but enough to tell a story of hardship. He straightened and nodded. You've seen worse, haven't you? Same as me. Still, he wanted the judgment of someone wiser. The next morning, he led Solace unhaltered, unshod, toward Lone Rock. The horse followed willingly, though, with the air of one indulging a stubborn friend. Townsfolk turned their heads as Elias passed down the dusty street, murmurs rising. A Mustang walking tame beside a man was no everyday sight. At the apothecary's corner, Dr. Clara Monroe stood in her apron, spectacles glinting. She looked up from sweeping and blinked in surprise. Lord above, Elias. You've gone and brought a ghost to town. Not a ghost, Elias replied, patting the horse's neck. Just a stubborn beast that won't leave me be. Clara set aside her broom and approached slowly, her hands gentle, her eyes sharp. She ran her fingers down Solace's flank along the scar to the hooves. The horse twitched, but did not bolt. Well, she said at last, straightening. This one knew the hand of man once. See how it accepts touch. It's been broken to saddle before, though no brand marks remain. Either it slipped free or someone let it go. Elias's brow furrowed. So it belongs to no one now. Clara shook her head. No claims I can see. Wild but not lost. And if it stays near you by choice. She gave a small smile. That's rarer than gold, Elias. Horses don't pick men often. Seems to me this one's picked you. Elias looked into Solace's eyes, dark and unblinking. Something flickered in his chest, quiet but undeniable. The walk back to Boone Ranch was slow, deliberate. Solace trailed at his side, without rope or rein, free yet faithful. Elias's mind turned over Clara's words. All his life, he'd thought himself a man, without anchor. The war had stripped him of belonging, the ranch had withered, and his father had died before forgiveness could be spoken. He had wandered through days like a ghost, wearing skin. But here was this creature, scarred, stubborn, half-wild, choosing to stay. Not out of debt, not out of force, but out of some silent kinship. Elias stopped by the fence line, running a hand through the coarse mane. Solace stood still, ears, flicking breath warm against his palm. You're a free thing, Elias murmured. Could vanish into those hills whenever you please. But you don't. Maybe you see something in me worth standing by. His voice softened, breaking with honesty he rarely allowed. Truth is, I've been wandering too. Didn't think I belonged to anything anymore. The horse blinked, leaned its muzzle closer, and Elias let out a shaky laugh. He stroked the tangled mane, words slipping out like confession. Maybe we're both lost, but at least... His throat tightened. At least I ain't lost alone anymore. The Mustang snorted a soft, approving sound. And in that moment, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, Elias Boone understood that fate had tethered them not with rope, but with choice. Solace was no longer just a Mustang. It was his companion, his mirror, his solace. The weeks that followed were slow, deliberate, and strangely tender. Mara Whitfield remained at Boone Ranch under the watch of Elias and Dr. Clara Monroe. At first, she was pale as death, her strength almost entirely gone. But with rest, steady food, and careful hands tending her life began to creep back into her frame. Each morning, Elias would see her seated on the porch, wrapped in one of his old wool blankets, staring across the meadow, where Solace sometimes grazed. The sun lit her hair, once matted and filthy, now brushed into long auburn waves. Her cheeks regained the faintest hint of color. In the evenings, she walked a few steps along the rail, leaning on Elias's arm when her knees trembled. But the shadows lingered. At sudden noises, she would flinch, eyes darting as though back inside the dark room of the cabin. Sometimes she startled awake at night, whispering fragments of dreams she refused to describe. Elias never pressed her. He knew what it was to be haunted. Instead, he gave her space, brought water when she asked, and steadied her arm only when she reached for him. One night, while the lantern burned low and the wind sighed through the chinks in the cabin walls, Mara spoke for the first time of her father. Her voice was quiet, broken, yet filled with an ache deeper than the wounds on her skin. "My father's name was Jonas Whitfield," she began, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "He was the eldest son of the Whitfield family. Once they held some of the best land in Lone Rock, rich soil, good water. But when the time came to divide the inheritance, everything turned bitter. There was jealousy, suspicion, accusations. She swallowed hard. They cast him out. Said he was greedy, unworthy. He left with nothing but his hands and the clothes on his back." She paused, staring into the flame. "I grew up on his stories. Not whole stories, mind you. Bits and fragments always circling back to the same phrase, the house that turned its back. He never spoke the whole truth. I thought if I came here, maybe I'd find out what happened, why my father was driven away." Her eyes filled, voice trembling. "Instead, I nearly died in that same place. Ironic, isn't it? Searching for answers and finding only a locked door." Elias leaned back in his chair, arms folded. He thought of Silas Boone, his own father, strict, silent, unyielding. He remembered the words unsaid between them, the final chance for reconciliation snatched away by death. "No, Elias," said at last, voice low. Not ironic, just unfinished. It was Elias who suggested they return. Mara had been hesitant, the memory of those dark walls still pressing on her chest. But when Elias said, "If the cabin holds the truth, it's better we face it by daylight," something in her eyes shifted. Fear was still there, but so was resolve. "I have to know," she whispered. The following morning dawned bright and cold. Elias saddled his mare while Mara, still weak but determined, mounted a gentle gelding borrowed from a neighbor. Solace trailed beside them, untethered, as if it had appointed itself guardian of the journey. They carried lanterns, rope, and gloves. As the trees swallowed them, Mara's face grew pale, but she did not turn back. Elias kept close, steadying her reins, and the path grew narrow. The forest opened at last, and there it was, the Whitfield cabin, hunched and broken under the noon sun. Even in daylight, it looked a thing of ghosts. The roof sagged moss crawling along the shingles. The doorway hung crooked where Elias had forced it weeks before. Mara shuddered, pulling her shawl tight. Elias laid a hand on her shoulder, steady but light. "You're not alone this time." She nodded once. Together, they stepped inside. The air was still heavy, though, not as suffocating as it had been. Dust motes swirled in shafts of light. The floor groaned under their boots. Mara's eyes caught the small room at the back, and she froze. The place where she had been left to die. Her breath came shallow. "I thought that was the end," she murmured. Elias tightened his jaw. But it wasn't. You walked out. Solace waited just beyond the threshold, its shadow falling across the doorway, as though keeping watch. The steadiness of the animal's presence made the place less dreadful somehow. While searching the rafters, Elias noticed a board slightly out of place above the main room. He dragged a broken chair beneath it and steadied himself with a rope looped over a beam. With effort, he pried the warped plank aside. A rush of stale air and cobwebs fell into his face. Holding the lantern aloft, he peered into the gloom. A crawl space stretched just far enough to hide something. Elias hauled himself up. His boots scraped against beams as he crawled forward. In the corner beneath the layers of dust sat a wooden box. Its lid was scarred initials, faint but legible. J.W. Hart, hammering Elias, dragged the box back to the opening and lowered it down carefully. Mara waited below, eyes wide. Together, they pried it open. Inside lay a bundle of letters, their paper yellowed and brittle. A sheaf of legal documents half completed, bearing stamps and signatures. And atop them all, a torn page, words scrawled in an unsteady hand. "I'm sorry." Mara's fingers trembled. She lifted the fragment. "It's his handwriting," she breathed. They spread the contents across a makeshift table. Elias lit another lantern, its glow pooling over the paper. The letters told a story, piece by piece, anguish bleeding through every word. Jonas Whitfield had not been greedy as the tales claimed. He had fought only for what was fair, his rightful portion of the land. But his brothers painted him as a usurper. In letter after letter, he pleaded with his parents for reconciliation, begging to return, swearing he wished only peace. No reply ever came. One letter from a law office spoke of changes to the family will. Jonas had been struck out, his name erased. The property would go entirely to his younger siblings. The ink was cold, the verdict final. Mara covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. He wasn't the villain they made him out to be. He was cast aside, lied about, all these years. Her gaze fell on the unfinished note. The words were few, but heavy. "I'm sorry." For what? For leaving? For failing to protect his daughter from this legacy? For dying before he could explain? The silence left the questions sharper than any answer. Elias touched the edge of the page. "Your father wasn't a traitor. He was a man wronged by his own kin." Mara shook her head, voice breaking. "He died, carrying their rejection. And I grew up thinking the shame was ours to bear." The lantern flickered. The cabin's shadows seemed to recede, as though the truth itself had driven them out. Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded. He thought of his own father, of Silas Boone's hard eyes, and harder words of the gulf that had never been bridged. Though their stories differed, the pain was the same, fathers and sons, sundered by silence. "Funny," Elias murmured. "Your father and mine. Different men, same wound. Pride, secrets, leaving us to carry the weight." Mara pressed the letters to her chest. "But now I know. That means I don't have to run from it anymore." She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "The truth matters, even if it's ugly, even if it hurts." Elias met her gaze. Her eyes, still red with tears, held something steadier now. Resolve. "Then we won't hide it," he said. "We'll see it through, not just for him, for you." She nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "And for you too, Elias. We both need to let the past rest." Outside, Solace let out a low nicker, as though in agreement. And in the broken cabin of the Whitfields, two wounded souls understood that the ruins of the past could also be the foundation of something new. When Mara was strong enough to leave her sickbed, Elias offered her one of the spare rooms in the Boone house. It wasn't much, just a narrow chamber with a single bed, a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out across the fields. Dust lay thick on the dresser, and cobwebs clung to the corners. But when Mara set her bundle of belongings down, she whispered, "It feels alive here." The Boone ranch was a far cry from comfort. The log walls bore scars of weather and neglect, gaps patched with whatever Elias could find. The kitchen table was warped, one chair missing a leg. The roof creaked whenever the wind blew too hard. Yet the fireplace burned each night, filling the rooms with a gentle warmth that Mara had not known for years. The little house might have been crumbling at the edges, but it was safe. And for both of them, that was enough. By day they worked side by side. Elias split logs with his axe, the steady rhythm of his swing echoing across the yard. Mara gathered the smaller pieces, stacking them neatly, learning the patience of country work. She learned to haul water from the well, to scatter hay in the troughs, to coax the scrawny horses toward her hand. When the fences sagged, she held the posts while Elias hammered nails. Her palms blistered, but she never complained. In the evenings, they shared plain suppers, cornbread, salted pork potatoes, roasted in the coals. Often silence hung between them, but it was not heavy. The quiet was companionable, the kind that came from two souls who no longer needed to fill the air with words. Mara found comfort in the scrape of Elias's chair across the floor, in the way he poured her coffee without asking, in the way Solace's shadow drifted across the yard at twilight. As the days deepened into weeks, something wordless began to grow between them. It showed itself in fragments, Mara speaking softly about her childhood, how her father Jonas had carried a bitterness he never explained. He would sit by the fire. She recalled his hands clenched as if holding on to something he couldn't let go. I didn't understand then. Now I think he was haunted by what his family did. Elias listened, his rough hands resting on his knees. "I know that look," he said after a while. "I've seen it in the camps after battle. A man can carry the weight of silence heavier than any wound." One evening he admitted, almost against his will, "I hear the war every night. Gunfire, men screaming, and my father's voice too sharp as a whip. I never made peace with him. He died before I could." Mara didn't try to answer with platitudes. She only touched his sleeve lightly and whispered, "I understand." Sometimes she woke to the sound of Elias thrashing in his sleep, breath ragged. She would creep to her door and see Solace standing in the yard, ears pricked, releasing a soft, steady nicker, as if to hold Elias's nightmares at bay. Mara thought of the Mustang as a keeper of dreams, a silent sentinel against the darkness neither of them could control. In this rhythm of work, confession, and silence, trust took root. Not through vows or declarations, but through the steady act of sharing burdens. One morning, as mist curled above the fields, Mara spoke words that would alter everything. "I don't want the Whitfield cabin to remain a prison in my memory," she said, setting down the bucket she had carried. "I want to rebuild it. Not as the place where I nearly died, but as Whitfield's haven, a place where the past can be set free." Elias froze the axe heavy in his hand. For a long time, he said nothing. Mara feared he would dismiss her, tell her it was foolish that the cabin should be left to rot. But at last he nodded. "If we can't erase the scars, we can build something on top of them. That's reason enough." The resolve in his voice startled even him. He realized that in helping Mara redeem her father's house, he might also redeem his own regrets about Silas Boone. To rebuild the Whitfield cabin was to mend something inside both of them. So the decision was made. They would not let the cabin remain a monument to suffering. They would turn it into a place of belonging. The work began with sweat and stubbornness. Elias tore down the worst of the beams, dragging them into piles for burning. Mara helped pull weeds that had claimed the walls, her skirts gathering burrs and dust. Together, they heaved the rotting boards into the yard, the crash of timber echoing through the hollow. Each strike of the hammer, each plank ripped free, felt like driving back ghosts. Elias hauled fresh pine from the slopes above the ranch shoulders, straining beneath the weight of logs. Mara steadied the saw while he cut them to size. Her hands blistered and bled, but she bound them with cloth and kept working. When Elias noticed her wincing, she forced a grin. "These blisters mean, I belong here, don't they?" For the first time in weeks, Elias laughed a rough, rusty sound that startled them both. They replaced the roof with new shingles, hammered nails into freshly carved beams. They fitted panes of glass brought from Lone Rock into frames Elias had planed by hand. Yet they left a few of the original posts standing scarred and weathered to remind them of the history that could not be erased. While sweeping the debris, Mara discovered small relics hidden beneath the floorboards. A silver spoon, tarnished black, the broken frame of a daguerreotype, a moth-eaten quilt. She gathered these in a wooden chest, treating them not as refuse, but as fragments of memory worth preserving. By the end of the second week, the cabin no longer sagged like a corpse. Its frame stood proud against the sky, a skeleton reborn. Mara wiped sweat from her brow and whispered, "It's breathing again." Elias only nodded, but his heart thudded with agreement. Through it all, solace never strayed far. The Mustang loitered near the porch head, lifting whenever Elias swung the hammer. Sometimes it trotted to the creek and back as if inspecting the perimeter. Once, while Elias hauled a water bucket, Solace plunged its muzzle into the barrel, sloshing half the contents onto Mara's dress. She burst into laughter, the first unguarded laugh since her rescue. Elias froze stunned by the sound, then found himself grinning too. News of their work spread quickly. Lone Rock was a small town, and stories traveled on the wind. Children began wandering up the trail, eager to glimpse the Mustang that locals whispered about. They clustered near the fence, pointing and giggling. "That's the horse that saved the lady," one boy exclaimed. Another girl whispered wide-eyed, "They say it knows when danger's coming." Mara smiled and waved them closer, though they never dared step past the fence. She leaned toward Elias one afternoon as the children scattered and said, "Seems Solace is more famous than either of us." Elias snorted. "Wouldn't surprise me if the town starts carving legends about him before the year's out." Yet in truth, he didn't mind. Seeing the children's awe, hearing Mara's laughter, eased the shadows that once clung to the cabin. As the weeks turned to months, the reconstruction of the cabin became something more than carpentry. Each swing of the hammer, each plank nailed into place, was like stitching shut a wound. Elias felt the heaviness of battle memories lift with every day's labor. The discipline of building gave his hands purpose beyond survival. Mara, too, found herself transformed. Scrubbing dirt from the floorboards, she whispered, "This isn't just about my father anymore. It's about me finding a place to stand." When she looked up, her eyes shone with determination Elias had not seen before. One evening, the sky burned crimson. They stood side by side, watching the rebuilt frame glow in the sunset. Mara drew in a trembling breath. "From this day," she said, "this place is no grave. It's a home." Elias turned to her, the light catching in his eyes. He didn't speak, but the nod he gave was deeper than words. In that moment, the past was no longer their master. The cabin had become their covenant, a vow to rebuild not only wood and stone, but themselves. One afternoon, as he watered the horses at the trough behind the cafe, an old rancher with a scar across his chin came over and shoved his hands into his pockets. "Boone," he said. "Never figured I'd say this, but good thing you came home." Elias wiped his hands on his pants and nodded once. "Reckon so. It wasn't an absolution. It wasn't even a complete sentence. But it was the first time in a long while that belonging didn't feel like a coat 2 sizes too small." The cabin rose out of ruin with the slow stubbornness of winter wheat. Weeks of labor stitched new timbers to old scars, until the roof sat square and the frame stood proud. Fresh panes of glass winked in the sun where broken mouths had been. Inside, a rough-hewn table anchored the main room, weighty, plain, honest. Chairs of every lineage surrounded it, one from the boarding house storeroom, one bought for a handful of coins, one gift from Sheriff Harlan Reed's own porch. A little shelf on the far wall held the letters and papers they'd found bound with twine and a ribbon Mara had saved since childhood. Dust no longer ruled the corners. The air smelled of pine and soap and something like reprieve. On the day they finished, Mara climbed the new steps with a wooden plaque hugged close to her chest. She'd carved it herself with slow, careful strokes, sanding the letters at night by lamplight. She held it up to the lintel and looked to Elias with a question in her eyes. He steadied the board while she drove the small nails home. Whitfield's Haven. They stepped back together. The sign caught the light, simple as a prayer. Elias read it aloud, the words thick in his throat. From now on, he said, voice low, it ain't a ghost of the past. Mara's smile was small and fierce. No, she answered. It's a place to live. They stood there longer than the moment required, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the wind comb the grass. The cabin did not look new exactly. It looked faithful, as if it had kept an all-night vigil and finally seen the sun. They marked the opening with a gathering no grander than a Sunday supper. The afternoon had the copper softness of late autumn. Sheriff Reed came in a fresh shirt and an expression that tried not to be tender. Dr. Clara Monroe arrived with a basket that steamed of tea and molasses cookies. Clara O'Donnell appeared bearing cornbread and stories. Behind her trailed half a dozen neighbors, their curiosity wrapped in good manners and shawls. Solace stood in the yard like a statue, hacked from the dusk mane lifting and falling. Chairs scraped, boots scuffed. The new floor took their weight without complaint. Folks found spots along the walls and near the hearth. Conversation lapped and ebbed. Then Mara stepped to the center, a folded letter in her hands. They quieted as if a church bell had rung. She looked smaller there, pale and strong, at the same time the room holding its breath for her. Elias saw her swallow twice, saw the tremor in the paper. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear ring of someone who has already survived the worst. "This is my father's letter," she said. "It was never sent. It was waiting here for me." She unfolded it. The script was uneven ink, blotted where a hand had hesitated. "I'm sorry," she read. "I am sorry for leaving in anger. I am sorry for not being the son they wanted. I am sorry for the years I could not give you a true home. I fought for what I believed was fair, and when I lost pride, kept me from coming back with empty hands. If you find this, know that I wished I had been braver. Know that I loved you more than I could say." Her voice frayed, then steadied. The room had gone so still the tick of the new clock on the mantel sounded loud. She continued the letter, shorter than a life, long enough to mend one. "I wanted to return, but the door I left keeps closing in my mind. If there is grace left for me, it will be because you, my child, live a kinder story than the one I wrote. When she finished, no one spoke. A woman in the corner dabbed at her eyes with the edge of her shawl. A ranch hand stared hard at his boots. Dr. Clara pressed her lips together and breathed slow. Sheriff Reed cleared his throat, then cleared it again. "Reckon that's the whole of it," he said at last, not unkindly. "The tragedy of a family. But today, it's set down." He tipped his hat toward Mara. "You did right, bringing it into the light." Mara folded the letter back along the old creases and tied it with its ribbon. "It doesn't excuse what they did," she said. "But it tells the truth about who he tried to be." Clara O'Donnell, who had never in her life known when to hold her tongue and had never much wanted to spoke up from the doorway. And we're here, aren't we, eating and breathing and listening in a house that should have been a grave. That counts for something. A low murmur of assent moved through the room, like the first roll of distant thunder. Somebody set a tin mug on the table with a clack. Somebody else laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, but because the body must choose between laughter and tears sometimes, and this time chose both. Elias watched Mara tuck the letter onto the shelf, watched the way her shoulders eased an inch lower. He felt something loosen in him too, one of those knots a man ties in his own gut when he's young and scared, and never quite gets around to untying. He had not earned forgiveness from his father and would never hear it spoken, but he could build a place where somebody else's father found it at last. That felt near enough to grace for a man like him. They ate, they told stories. Folks took turns standing in the doorway to stroke Solace's neck. Quick, reverent touches, the way people touch relics when they're not sure if the saints are listening. The Mustang endured it all, with the tolerant air of a creature that knows it belongs to itself. When the shadows pooled and the guests began to drift home, lanterns bobbing, voices thinning along the path, Sheriff Reed lingered. He clasped Elias's shoulder with a grip that said more than his mouth ever would. "Good work," he said simply. "Both of you." "Thank you, Sheriff." "To my eye," Reed added, glancing up at the sign, "Haven suits it." "It does," Elias said. "And suits you," the sheriff said almost as an afterthought, then tipped his hat and was gone. Evening fell like warm water. The sky above the prairie found that fierce western gold and set the grass alight. Elias, Mara, and Solace stood side by side on the porch, not speaking, not needing to. The Mustang stepped forward until it was close enough to fog their sleeves with its breath. It drew a long, filling lungful, as if it meant to keep the colors of the sunset inside itself for later. Mara laid her hand along the strong curve of its neck. Elias folded his arms on the rail and let his gaze run the length of the land where the last light gathered and poured itself away. A hawk cut a clean stroke westward. Somewhere, a coyote yipped. The new windows caught the sky and gave it back in 4 neat rectangles. Mara leaned her shoulder against Elias's arm. He didn't move, but the knot inside him let out another inch of slack. "Feels like a different world," she said softly. "It is," he answered. The three of them lost Cowboy woman with a secret finally spoken, and the wild horse that refused to leave stood as if at the lip of a new country. The map not yet sketched, the roads not yet named. There are families carved in blood and law, and then there are the ones fate makes out of raw need and quiet choosing. This looked like the second kind. When the sun slid down and the chill came up, they went inside together. The days that followed wore a gentler face. Elias found an old ledger among Silas Boone's things, pages yellowed and brittle numbers marching like ants across the first half. He claimed the empty leaves for himself. Each evening by lamplight, he wrote not about accounts payable or the price of oats, but about the man he had loved badly and lost too soon. He wrote of a fishing trip where nothing was caught and everything important was said in the silence. He wrote of a winter morning his father had wordlessly wrapped an extra scarf around his neck. He wrote the last argument too and did not soften it. The words did their stitching. The ache did not vanish, but it was no longer wild. Mara took the Whitfield papers and copied them with a careful hand into a blank book. Letters fragments, the unfinished apology. She added dates where she could, questions where she could not, and a preface that began, "This is the story my father could not speak, and the one I choose to live beyond." She slipped the ribboned originals back on the shelf. The copy she kept on the table as if to invite conversation with anyone who came through the door. As for solace, freedom was the only promise the Mustang ever kept or asked for. Some mornings the horse was gone before the sky paled. Some evenings it returned out of the dark with a toss of its head, as if to say that all was still in order across a range only it knew. Dawn and dusk found it most often standing broadside, to the light made of shadow and fire by turns. It had no brand and wore no halter, and yet it belonged to this place, same as the two people who had decided not to run anymore. One morning, as the frost burned off the grass and the smell of coffee brought the day close, Mara looked up from her pages and said, "You ever think about what comes next?" Elias set his pencil down. "Every day." She smiled. "Me too." He reached for his ledger again, the motion easy now, and Solace lifted its head outside the window, ears pricked toward the east. The cabin creaked, the kettle whispered, the future waited, without hurrying. And for the first time in a long while, all three of them felt ready to meet it.